Hello, how are y'all? So sorry I'm running a little bit behind. My previous class I was trying to wrap up there. So can y'all hear me okay?
We can, I can.
Thumbs up,
Thank
great.
you. Hello.
Ah, absolutely. Well, sorry for the wait. We will get going here. The we In my previous class I was just teaching, we were talking through um, the rest of psychosis and bipolar and depression. And I want to do that with you guys just to kind of review some of it, but also talk a little bit more about depression and DMDD with the kiddo side of stuff. But I also want to reserve some time, about 20, hopefully 30 minutes if I can, reserve some time as a designated Q&A in relation to all things private practice, like if you want to go into private practice someday, or even if not, just, getting a job, the practical side of all this stuff, in addition to questions related to like practicum, like how, what do I do, how to get a practicum, what is practicum, where am I? Just kidding. Hopefully you know where you are. Um, Also licensure questions, internship, postmaster stuff, and then, even specialty like certifications, all that stuff. I want to reserve some time today to have that Q&A. I tend to try to do that week 5 and week 10, so we're going to do this again, but we'll spend all of week 10's class only doing this. And so if you miss something or if you think something between now and then, don't worry, because we're going to do it again. Okay? Um, so for tonight, let me pull up PowerPoint slides. It's always funny because I always pull up PowerPoint slides as if I'm going to use them. It probably drives you all crazy that I never actually use my PowerPoint slides when I'm talking, but it's just good to
Which
have as a
one, which one
resource.
are you, which one are you opening right now so we can follow on our own
Yep.
also?
Week 4, uh, the module 4, depressive and bipolar disorders.
Got it. Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen real quick. There we go. And before we jump into depression and bipolar, I do want to make one more like comment on the psychosis in kiddos. Actually, a couple more, but I don't need the slides for that. One is, hopefully you will always remember that before adolescence, before puberty, true psychoses, as it relates to like schizophrenia or like a psychiatric syndrome, is very rare. Okay? It's so rare that I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure I've ever seen like child onset schizophrenia. Now, I've been referred a whole lot of kiddos that are prepubescent for the purpose of ruling out a psychotic disorder because they were seen like talking to themselves, or they talk about seeing like, you know, uh, hallucinations of like demons or scary stuff, or hearing voices. And in most of those cases, it is usually explained either by autism spectrum disorder, where we're having echolalia. Y'all know what that is? So echolalia is where some kiddos with autism, some people with autism, when they hear somebody say something, they will repeat it silently to themselves, but sometimes it's not really silently, it's actually just whispering it. But then they'll get like this loop of a conversation in their head, or like something that somebody says, and they'll say it repetitively out loud, like in a whisper or real quiet. They may even be self-conscious about it, but it's almost like a compulsive, like uh, vocal tic, except like a complex conversation sometimes, a back and forth that they'll repeat. That's called echolalia. And if you didn't know what that was, you'd see, an 8-year-old over there by themselves looking like they're having a conversation with somebody, saying something out loud. You might think that was psychosis, right? So that's a common reason. Another common explanation is some sort of depressive syndrome occurring where young kids, the younger they are, or really not the younger necessarily as much as it is, the less or the more concrete they are in their thinking, which obviously the younger we are, that the more concrete they become, the less they're able to have abstract thought about how they feel, or even the less they are able to identify or communicate verbally how they're feeling, the more likely they're going to experience like things like sadness or anxiety in a more tangible way, which is often the perception of like negative voices talking to them, or seeing scary things, like at night, or shadows. Okay? That's the same principle I want you to also keep in mind for kiddos with intellectual disorders, because you'll see like a teen who, because of their cognitive weaknesses or limitations, they still lack that abstract reasoning ability, or the self-awareness, or even the ability to verbalize what they're feeling, and will oftentimes, like a little child would with depression, you'll see a teen with like IDD exhibiting what appears to be a psychosis, but it's actually in relation to their depression and not a true psychosis. Does that make sense? Yep.
Sure. Sure.
And so the question is, like, if let's say that teen was sitting in front of you, or you had a referral from somebody saying, hey, this kiddo might have schizophrenia. The question is, well, how am I going to know? Well, number one, you kind of need to always have an idea about where your client is intellectually compared to their peers. In most cases, you will know, even if it's not formally diagnosed, but you will know if they have an intellectual disorder. In most cases. So if you know that for a fact, and then that same person is referred to you for, what appears to be like schizophrenia, and they're a teen, you're going to keep it at the forefront of your mind to remember that it might be that their mental age is what's causing them to have these symptoms, because it's really related to depression, and they don't have the abstract reasoning to conceptualize what depression is, so they find something more tangible. Another good sign that that's what's occurring is they'll often also have physical symptoms or physical reactions, like their stomach hurting all the time, or headaches all the time. So when little kids or teens with IDD, when they're depressed or anxious, they won't say they're anxious or depressed, but they will talk about how they're physically hurting, like their stomach's hurting all the time, or they have like aches and pains or things like that. Okay? It's interesting. That concept is interesting because later on when we talk about somatoform disorders, where people experience their psychiatric illnesses as physical symptoms, like in adulthood mainly, but that's actually a normal thing the younger the child is. So, in other words, like a 5-year-old, for example, will be more like a 5-year-old who has depression will be more likely to complain much more so about all, their stomach hurting than they will even admitting that they feel sad. And they may not even recognize they feel sad or feel scared. Because that physical feeling is a lot more concrete, a lot more tangible. And it's not their decision that they're doing that. It's just that their brain lacks the capacity yet to conceptualize anything like that. Okay? And that's pretty normal the younger you go. Once you hit about 7, 8 on average is whenever kids start getting better at describing feeling sad. Usually that's the words that they'll use. Just sad. A lot of kids these days, it's kind of been surprising to me, they know what the word anxiety means. Yep. Which is kind of a good and a bad thing. Bad thing meaning like I wish no kid ever had to learn that word. But I'm glad though that something has taught them what the word anxiety is, given them a language to it. Okay. The other thing with psychoses, real quick, around 12, which is kind of rare, but 13, 14 on, it's not uncommon for like a true psychotic disorder to emerge. I don't see that as often as I see like 19, 20, 21 as being like the first psychosis or the first psychotic symptoms to emerge, but I have seen it down to age 12 regularly enough to kind of just throw that out there as like a roundabout number. And so the older the child gets, you're still keeping all that other stuff in your mind, but now you're also starting to think, okay, well, this could also, the probability for a true psychotic disorder being present increases the older you get.
Dr. Armstrong, I have a question. I have a student right now.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember. He's like 17, 18 years old. Um, Honor student, top of the class. He comes in. He'll say that he's God, that he knows all things. Just very peculiar behavior over the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And mom said he does not have a diagnosis yet. I'm a school counselor too, so
Wow. And does that stuff go away or did it just emerge and it's just kind of stuck there? And is he
it kind of
still doing well academically?
academically he's still doing well. But like I said, he has these episodes.
Yeah.
Uh, not drug related, does not do drugs. Um, just very odd behavior. Like the last episode, he went to another school and tried to enroll. And
Wow.
after they told him he could not enroll, he said, "Can I just come volunteer?" And then he came into my office that same day and just very peculiar behavior, was asking me questions that had nothing to do with school, that actually had something to do with my sorority. He was asking me all about my sorority, and it was like a blank stare. He didn't look at
Yeah.
me. He was just looking at the wall.
Hmm. So obviously I can't,
Yeah.
diagnose or
Mm,
evaluate, but what I would say is
mm-hmm.
in general, what you're describing sounds more along the lines of a bipolar mania
Mm-hmm. Okay.
rather than what you would typically see with like schizophrenia. Now, there's a
Okay.
caveat. There's a caveat, and the reason why is because bipolar mania. That's why I went to this slide. Is the real separation from it as compared to like a schizophrenia is
Mm-hmm.
that bipolar you tend to only get those delusional like that delusional thinking or the grandiose kind
Mm-hmm.
of thinking
Mm-hmm.
in the manic stages, which are
Okay.
time limited
Mm-hmm.
and go away.
Okay.
With schizophrenia, you can still get those delusions, but they tend to be persistent over time.
Okay.
They kind of stick. It's almost like the person's
Okay.
personality changes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And they don't come back to
Okay.
baseline. They just seem forever after that. Um, Not nearly as like delusional, but just yeah, like something has shifted in their perception and that doesn't go away. As compared to bipolar where they go up and then they come back
And then
down
they're
and like,
back to themselves. Okay.
I can't believe that I said all that stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. And that's a that's a great example of how complicated it is to try to distinguish between a discrete bipolar versus a discrete schizophrenia. Because I'm here to tell you that despite the DSM saying that schizoaffective disorder is a rare thing, just anecdotally, I'm telling you, that's more the rule than the exception, meaning that in most cases that I've seen with teens and adults, but teens, they will often present with both bipolar like fluctuations of their mood, and even when this is stabilized, it seems like something is shifted and there's a psychosis present as well. And when those two things are combined, that's the diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. Okay?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So um, the question is uh, also, how helpful or how useful is it really to distinguish between those two things? And actually, I'm going to back up real quick. We know that neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism and ADHD, and for that matter, intellectual disorders, IDD, we know that those things increase a child's risk for eventually developing uh, bipolar and increase their risk for developing schizophrenia, and just on average, increase their chance of developing depression at some point in their life. But in most cases that I've seen with bipolar in adults or schizophrenia in adults, when you go back and actually review their childhood history, I can't remember off the top of my head any cases not having probable ADHD and or autism. I'm not saying it's impossible, but and you're not going to read that in the DSM-5, but I'm here to tell you that if an adult has bipolar, the very first thing in my mind is, well, they probably also have ADHD and or autism. And again, it's not like we're trying to throw a bunch of labels at somebody. It's just that the APA has not caught up with the fact that this stuff has so much more overlap than what we would all like. Now, with that being said, does that mean every kid with ADHD or autism is going to have bipolar or develop schizophrenia? No. In fact, the vast majority don't. But I have just personally never met an adult who had bipolar schizophrenia who also didn't have ADHD and or autism. So it's kind of is what it is there. Um, with the classical way of looking at mood, what you need to remember is that depression is not enough dopamine and not enough serotonin, okay? And not enough norepinephrine. So in order to be depressed, and this is oversimplification, but it works well enough that we can say it. Depression equals not enough dopamine, not enough serotonin, not enough norepinephrine. When you don't have enough of those things, you don't have very much physical or cognitive energy. Things that you do day to day, like even just being alive, are not as rewarding as what they typically are. For something to subjectively be rewarding to you, like if if your favorite food is pizza, you take a bite of pizza, well, if you're not depressed, your brain shoots out a bunch of dopamine, says, this is awesome, let's do that again, and it always remembers how great pizza was. When you're depressed, guess what? You take a bite of pizza, even if it was your favorite, it literally and physically won't taste the same to you and won't be nearly as good, won't be as rewarding because it's not producing, there's not enough dopamine and serotonin, norepinephrine that is released when that happens. In addition to that, physical energy declines as well. So kiddos tend to be a lot sleepier, especially teens with depression. They're already sleepy anyway because they're not getting enough sleep. But there tends to be a lack of energy, a lack of like ambition or drive, or an even like, and this is how you'll know, this is one of the unique ways that kids and teens will manifest depression is by not being interested in the extracurricular activities that they used to. So I've seen a kiddo that was, a teen who was like a superstar athlete who became depressed. This actually happened after a head injury, like in football, but who the next season rolls around and had depression that nobody really recognized, but the first thing that really the symptom that emerged was no interest or desire in wanting to play football or any sports, or just kind of just withdrawing. Grades start declining, and they start withdrawing socially as well. The other unique symptom of depression in kids and adolescents is anger. I'm not saying adults with depression aren't extra angry, because a lot of them are. The irritability tends to increase, but particularly with kids, the younger they are, and then with teens, that oftentimes is the main like overt symptom of depression. Is they used to be just real like laid back, and all of a sudden they're just real irritable, and like they lose their patience and explode in anger. So when that happens, and that's a shift from previous like temperament style, the first thing that I'm thinking through is this is possible depression. Okay? And it makes sense too, because if you have ever been hangry, like hungry, angry, right? The reason why you get hungry, angry is literally because your brain is craving dopamine.
Oh.
Yeah. And you eat, eat your Snickers or whatever it is, and all of a sudden you're like, I'm so sorry. I don't even care about, whatever we argued about, or my irritability. Like I just, I was just hungry. Yeah. That symptom is the same reason or occurs for the same reason that kiddos will get angry and teens will get angry when they're depressed.
Is can you talk to slide number 6 for a second? This
Hmm.
chronic stress related inflammation and depression.
Yeah, let
So
me.
it's the picture.
Hmm.
And so some of what you just said, like, well, these are other things in the center in that blue box. I thought that was some of what you were touching on, but
In the blue box.
yeah.
Um,
What's going on in this? So the stress brain loop.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So let's talk about that because that's in relation to this. So your body will increase and decrease the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine serotonin in relation directly to stress hormones. Okay? So when you first wake up in the morning, um, there's a rapid increase in stress hormones or cortisol levels in the body. And that's good. It's natural. It's a natural diurnal like fluctuation. It's not just diurnal. In fact, it fluctuates throughout the day. But it does that. Stress hormones increase because if they didn't, you'd stay asleep. You need your body you need your sympathetic system to win that tug of war during the day so that you can be awake and alert, motivated, right? Attentive, and in a good enough mood to have the desire to do anything in relation to survival. Now, throughout the day, it fluctuates a little bit, and then at night or towards the evening, those stress hormones start to drop, which then pulls you back down into falling asleep and resting. Chronic stress, chronic psychological stress, or even chronic physical stress for that matter, like autoimmune disorders or like physical illnesses and disease and injuries. What that does is it disrupts that normal healthy cycle of back and forth because it's adding extra, release of stress hormone when it shouldn't be released, which is why most people with chronic stress, right, struggle falling asleep. Because they've got too high of the stress hormones going. And you can think about it like stress hormones happen first. And I always think of it, it's kind of a silly way of looking at it, but maybe it'll help you. I think about stress hormones being like a boat, like a ski boat. And then like the serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine being like skiers, like holding on, and they're just following the ski boat around, right? So wherever stress hormones go, they go.
huh.
And that happens except when that ski boat is, too like back and forth or it goes too fast, for example, just use that as a metaphor. Eventually, that ski rope breaks. And there's a decoupling of the dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin link to the stress hormones. In other words, it burns them out. And so you have these stress hormones that are going back and forth that are typically supposed to drive, like, and push how much dopamine we have, how much serotonin, and so forth. But eventually, if you have a long enough chronic stress, there's a de-pairing of those two to where dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin need a break. They've let go of the ski rope and they need a rest before they get back on and try to ski again. And so their levels remain low. That's an oversimplification of it, but
Okay.
it's
So on
physiologically what happens.
on this chart in the middle, stress hormones sensitize body brain to respond to inflammatory molecules. And it says brain is more easily rewired when under stress. I don't understand that bullet point.
Okay.
Because I thought
Yeah.
when you're under stress, things are not going to cooperate.
So,
But why is it? I don't know what that means.
well, when we say under stress and that, what you just said, things don't work well under chronic stress
Okay.
as compared to short-term or acute stress, which our brains and bodies handle really well. So if you think about it this way, our brain is still living back in times where we were, on the regular, like chased by animals, like wild animals. And in order to survive, our brain had to use that acute stress to learn, okay, I should probably not walk in the woods at night because that's where all the scary animals are. And so, in other
So
words, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So in acute stress episodes, our brains are primed to remember, gosh, I never ever want to go back into that dark forest again. Because by doing so, it's going to increase the chance of me surviving. Now, after that event occurs, the brain, shot up real high with stress hormones. We learned what we needed to learn, and now we're no longer, around that animal we escaped. And so our brain can just, our whole body can go back down to normal baseline. But when you stay up there too long, let's say you can't get away from, taxes, for example, or in kiddos, like academics, that's the big one, or social pressure, like social media. When
Uh-huh.
there's no escape, we're staying at that level too long. And the longer we stay there, we are learning, like, I don't like, we need to stay away from the dark forest. We need to stay off of Facebook, whatever it is. But the longer we stay there, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin the rope that connects the boat starts
Yep.
to,
They
to,
disconnected again. Okay.
yep.
I get it. That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's what makes us unique as humans. And again, with all your free time, you really should read Robert Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers book as a starter. He's got newer ones too that are just as good. But he talks a lot about the idea that as humans, we can think ahead where, as adults, we can, even when we're on a beach, in the most like safe, like relaxing environment, we can think about retirement and have a panic attack. As compared to, most other animals, actually all other animals, as far as we know, if they're in a safe place in the here and now, they're not worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. They're not thinking about, gosh, am I going to regret, making this career decision whenever I'm 80? Like, in other words, they don't have chronic stress in the same way we do because their cognition doesn't allow them to. But because we can, which is great, we can live a lot longer because of it. It also opens up the opportunity to have intrinsic chronic stress psychologically. The younger we are, the less we have the capacity to do that, which is why 5-year-olds, not that they can't be stressed out, they can. But I've never met any 5-year-old who's worried about what they're going to do in high school. They're not thinking that far ahead yet because they don't have that cognitive capacity. Now, teens, on the other hand, that's when you start seeing a lot of the anxiety-related disorders emerge for the first time ever because they have the capacity now to worry about things in the future. Whereas kiddos, the younger they are, they typically worry about what's in the here and now. I know it's kind of anxiety stuff that we're talking about, but it relates to all this because with, yep, you got it. But it relates to all this because, well, chemically, depression and anxiety are the same thing. We know that because guess what? Antidepressants, believe it or not, are actually more effective for anxiety disorders than they are even for depression. Now, as it relates to kiddos, let me see. We've got not just this stress hormone system that's fluctuating back and forth, but the brain is also learning how much stress hormone we need, how little do we need for the long haul. So it's not that like we're born with like a general idea of how much stress hormone we need, in the morning or in the evening, so forth. But it's being conditioned or trained to find its average. And so kids are, to make a little bit more complicated, have an extra sensitivity to disruption extra sensitivity to things that disrupt their day-to-day stress hormone cycle. Which is why every single kid on the planet is going to behave better at school for the most part than they will at home. That's why every kid on the planet is going to feel less revved up, less anxious during the week than they will on a weekend or holidays or vacations. Because their brain is still learning that stress regulation or that stress hormone cycle back and forth. And they're just a lot more sensitive to disruption to it. But that's also a good thing because also guess what? Is if you're helping a kiddo through therapy, the opposite's also true. They're more sensitive to helping that stress hormone cycle re-regulate itself. So if you have an adult with depression working in psychotherapy, the prognosis is not nearly as great as it is with a kiddo that's depressed in psychotherapy. And the prognosis long term, if it's effective, the psychotherapy for that kiddo is you're building a brain that's going to be healthier for the long haul and less likely to be depressed again. Yeah. It'd be nice if that principle was also paired with the same principle that we have with adults, where adults, though, are in charge of, like, for the most part, they're in charge of their world. Like, they can decide, okay, I'm not going to work at this place anymore. This place is too stressful for me. It's healthy for me. I'm going to switch jobs. Kids don't have that same level of decision-making, freedom, which is the challenge with working with kids, is despite them being more easily treated when it's effective, it is also extra hard to treat them because it's not actually treating them. You're going to have to treat the system. Yeah. I know I say that a million times, but if you remember one thing from this class, remember that. Okay. Mood regulation in relation to the brain. The orbital prefrontal area. Y'all need to remember that. Right behind your eyeballs. That part of your brain, which isn't fully developed, so you're about 25, has a direct pathway to the amygdala on each side. Okay? That pathway begins its development and has a big jump in its ability, like for self-regulation, around age 2, 3, and 4. Okay? But even before then, oxytocin and attachment plays a big role at setting up that pathway for success. So if there's a good, healthy attachment between parents or mom and caretakers with a baby, in the first year of life, we know that that is going to equate to a stronger orbital prefrontal cortex connection to the amygdala later. So that's the first stage. Second stage is the terrible 2s and 3s and 4s, where literally kids, the wheels come off in a subconscious effort to get caretakers to teach them how to regulate their emotions. Because it's like, hey, we've got all this, all these building blocks here, but we don't know how to put them together. So let's make mom and dad, let's throw a fit right now and get mom and dad to teach us how to regulate ourselves. Okay. And then there's like a slowing down of that process for just a couple of years, which is nice because it's like they need like a breather. But then the pre-adolescent stage starts kicking in a couple of years before all the physical changes occur and the sex hormones start re-priming that part of the brain and ramping back up into a lot of the synaptic pruning that you hear about all the time during the teens. Because it's one thing to be able to handle the stress of my friend is playing with a toy that I want to play with, as compared to the stress of I got to have my own kids, get a job someday. Yep.
That's funny.
And what's interesting is that we've got, and just real quick, so we've got those two distinctions there. And I always thought, man, it'd be interesting if we just had one, like 1 4-year span instead of the terrible 2s and 3s and the teens, maybe just combining it all into middle adulthood or middle childhood. So you just get it over with. But for whatever
that
reason,
makes the parents crazy.
Yeah. That's probably why. Yeah.
Right. So I have a question. When you're talking about, different times when the disbehaving child is trying to figure out and learn its regulation and whatnot, is it true that I've heard this before, and I don't know if it is, that sometimes kids act up worse around their parents or their family because that's where they feel the safest? Have you heard that? Is there any logic in that or not?
And usually that's in relation to social peer pressure.
Oh.
So you'll see, for example, you'll see 5-year-olds, especially the younger ones, who will, it's like they never had wheels to come off, at home, but the wheels are off and they're just all over the place behaviorally, just emotionally, just dysregulated at home. And then the extra external social pressure of peers in kindergarten oftentimes will contain that a lot more.
Huh. Okay.
The same thing, by the way, with teens too, especially with autism. I see that a lot, where it's during the day, there's this containment of it. And then we kind of emotionally fall apart at home. That's not always the case. And in fact, if you ever get a young kiddo that you're working with that's 5, and a lot of times the parents are worried about their emotional regulation. If they're mature enough, I'll tell them that's listen, sometimes just by going to school, that initiates this higher level of maturity kind of kicks in, and they become more emotionally regulated when they first enter school. It's hard to predict. Sometimes it happens, and then other times it doesn't help out and seems to just persist even into their kindergarten and at home. And at that point, that's where what we're trying to do there is trying to set realistic expectations for where this kid's brain is developing compared to their peers. Yeah. And if we know what's more realistic, we can design environmental modifications and hopefully rule out, any neurodevelopmental reasons for them lagging behind. But a lot of times, Like I've had several kids lately, or actually this past school year, who just so happened to be younger than the rest of their class. They were like born in May or June in kindergarten, whereas everybody else in their class is born like in October. And they're like the one or two kids that were born in May or in June. And yeah, their teacher compared to, their peers in their class, they're going to seem real immature because that's like a lifetime for an adult. That's a big developmental difference. So it's always good to be mindful of like what's their age and who the person that is noticing their problems, what's the ages that they're comparing them to. So let's talk about DMDD real quick, and then we'll talk about the private practice stuff just for a few minutes anyway. But disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and I think we talked about it a little bit last time, right? We briefly jumped into it. Number one is that it's brand new as of 2013 in the DSM-5 because there's a whole bunch of kiddos out there that were previously diagnosed with pediatric bipolar disorder who didn't go on to actually have true bipolar disorder. But what you need to know about DMDD is I've yet to see research suggesting from a brain science standpoint that it is its own unique diagnosis that can occur by itself and apart from ADHD or autism. I have yet to see that research. If y'all come across that research, please by all means send it to me because I'd love to be just informed. But I have looked for that and there's nothing there. And the same goes for oppositional defiant disorder, by the way, which we'll talk about later on in the class. But DMDD and oppositional defiant disorder, in my opinion, is the result of some sort of neurodevelopmental syndrome or difference or disorder that is causing that child to have emotional regulation difficulties and a system or social, relationships and conditioning that's occurred to where this child is either consciously or subconsciously using their explosive like emotions or defiance in order to get their way. So what is DMDD then? So DMDD is kind of like having oppositional defiant disorder where there's this intentionality. It's like, it's like a 9-year-old that, it just flat out refuses to do their homework. It's like, I'm not going to do it. Nope, not going to do it. Just outright, just non-compliance. And it usually is targeted towards like one parent or the other. It's almost never both. Or just one teacher compared to other people. But there's like an intentionality behind it. But then also DMDD is like having that plus like explosive temper tantrums that are not age appropriate, but that seem to be almost instrumentally used. So like, it's like my, it's what a 3-year-old would do. It's where, you don't give them a piece of candy, and so they like look at you, and like you can see them thinking about it, and then they fall on the floor, start screaming, kicking their legs and everything, in an attempt to get you to give in and give them a piece of candy, right? There's an intentionality behind it. It's a real emotional regulation problem, but it's also there's a little bit of like on purpose. That's what DMDD is. And you'll know it mainly from parents coming to you and saying, about 3 or 4 times a week, it's like, it's always like homework, or it's like trying to get them to eat, food, or to stop watching, an iPad or something. Like there's like this explosive, out of control anger that they have tried to stop by not giving in. But when they do that, the child escalates it even further. And then this is kind of the classic story. They may inconsistently give in then whenever they escalate it, and then now that becomes the new normal. So there's just this ever increasing escalation of what a child will do. And it might have started with like the child just kind of whining and complaining, like, I'm going to make you eat your vegetables, and just whining, complaining, try to get out of it, to like throwing chairs, threatening to kill people, kill themselves, harming themselves, harming other people. I've seen it escalate to that point where it probably just started with like whining and complaining.
So what's the parent supposed to do? Hold the line? Don't give in? Is that what you're sort of
Once it
saying?
gets extra super
No,
escalated,
no, when we're down here at the, they don't want to eat their vegetables. Is that where you hold the line so that it doesn't keep on escalating?
so the idea is we're gonna be firm in our boundaries there, but also not just highlighting compliance, highlighting trying to reward and highlight really and focus on what's the rewarding aspect of what we want them to do. So if it's eating vegetables, it's not just like, hey, I want you to stop whining so much. I want you to actually eat your vegetables. So let's focus on that side of the equation too, by making it extra reinforcing for them to do so, and therefore preventing and decreasing the chance of them whining.
Okay.
Yep. But a lot of times, and I'm a parent of an 8 and a 5-year-old, and all this stuff's easier said than done. And by the way, please tell your parents that when you work with them, saying, listen, I went to school, I know I've got a master's. Yep, I know a lot. But I want you to also know I know this stuff is easier said than done. And it's okay if you're not perfect. We're trying to be perfect, but we're not going to be. But just keep trying. And kids are not computers. You can't program them. And so with the boundary setting, the quicker we can be firm and consistent. Well, I'll give you an example. If you were, let's say you were at a casino, you were playing like the slot machine, right? If you play the slot machine and you're playing, and all of a sudden for 4 hours you did not win anything. Well, eventually you'd either run out of money, or you'd be like, this is the worst game in the world. I'm not going to do this anymore. You'd stop, right? If you no longer won, you would stop pulling that little lever. But they don't do that. What do they do? You go there, you play like $10, and then you win a little bit, and then you might not win for like an hour or so, and then all of a sudden you win a big one, and you go another little bit, and then you just win like back and forth, and like you can't really predict it. And so you end up getting stuck there. And that's what happens with kiddos, is that when we're not consistent in our boundaries, in other words, they have to pull the lever this many times, this one time, and it didn't work. So they're going to pull it a few more times, and then now it works. So now that, we're built in superstitious. They're going to pull that lever that many times, and if that doesn't work, then they're going to try to ramp it up a little bit, see if maybe just a couple more tries, and then that's when I'm going to win. And eventually, it gets ramped up to where it's reinforced, and and actually what you need to remember too, that's the most powerful learning that can occur psychologically and cognitively, is the variable reinforcement interval. I'm going to write that in the chat. Y'all need to look that up whenever you get a chance. When a behavior is reinforced on a variable schedule like that, it's more likely to occur. That's the fastest you can get anybody to do anything again. But what we are going for is extinguishing their behaviors. And we do that by removing reinforcement, i.e., not giving in. It becomes exponentially more challenging to not give in when a kiddo gets ramped up so far to where they're hurting other people, threatening to kill themselves, maybe even trying to like hurt themselves. Yep. But that's our approach with DMDD and ODD for that matter. Now, the difference with DMDD is that that's a stressful state of the brain and often coincides with depression. So instead of diagnosing depression, though, we're going to call it DMDD because the irritability and the extra like hair trigger, like over the top catastrophic explosive anger reactions, the reason why it's a hair trigger is because they're depressed. Yeah. So I'm going to pause this right there because I'm actually going to have to run, unfortunately. But what I'll say is for the Q&A private practice stuff, we will 100% for sure at the beginning of class next time spend the next 20 minutes or so. So between now and next class, if you are going to be here next Sunday for the Zoom, think of some questions that you might have in relation to your practicum, all that stuff that that you didn't really want to have to think about till later. Think about that stuff now this week, and then come ready to ask questions about that, and hopefully I can help you walk through some of those questions. But we will definitely do that first thing next week.
Can I email it to you because I won't be here next Sunday?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I was about to say is for anybody that's not going to be here next Sunday, in the meantime, feel free to message me in Moodle, and I'll try to answer as clearly as I can there. But we'll also have another opportunity week 10 where the whole class, the whole time, is devoted just to that. And so if we miss it this time, you'll have another chance too. And then just so you know, it's not like, hey, well, you're done with class, you can't ever talk to me again. You have my email. You can always email me, even if you're not like a current student. Okay.
Thank you.
In fact, I met with a student that I hadn't seen in like 3 years, and they're almost finishing their program finally. I say finally because they said that. They're like, I'm finally getting there. But who I hadn't seen forever, we actually met through Zoom. We just scheduled a time for about 20, 30 minutes just talking through stuff. So I love doing that when I can. Okay.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
Is there another book besides the DSM to help us with the questions and the test, the test questions as we're trying to find them? Besides trying to buy some online thing.
It's not going to be another book.
Just type it in. I mean,
it's going to be just kind of doing your own research. Either, I mean, my slides can help a lot of times, but if it's not there, then it'll be in your research online.
Okay.
And that's where what's hard is some of those questions might be best answered through resources online, but as you know, some of that stuff changes. So you might find different answers, and if that's the case, please reach out and let me know and tell me like, hey, you don't have the right answer here. This is what the right answer is. You do that, guess what? You get that point as if it's right.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Any other questions? right. Well, hopefully this was helpful for tonight. And like I said, next class, we'll start with that. And then we jump pretty quickly into anxiety disorders, trauma, OCD, stuff like that. Sound good? All righty. Well, y'all have a great rest of your Sunday evening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.